They called the soldier they made from him Phantom Zero, but he remembered his name. His name was Kai Murasame, and the last thing he could recall before the dark was the sound of his sister laughing. She had laughed the way she always laughed, loud and unguarded, throwing her head back so her hair came loose from its braid. They had been flying at the time, a small twin-prop aircraft skimming the canopy of the Peruvian Amazon at 1,100 feet, the green below them so dense and continuous it looked like a living carpet thrown over the bones of the earth. Nadia was 23 years old and had never been in a cockpit before, and she was not afraid. She was delighted. She kept pressing her face against the side window like a child watching a parade, pointing at the bends in the river, at the shadows of birds large enough to be unmistakable from altitude, at the particular color of the sky where it hit the canopy edge. She made him name every instrument. She asked what would happen if both engines cut out at once. He told her they would glide down and land like a leaf. She said that sounded peaceful. Then the light came from above, not the sun. The sun was behind them, low and orange, a familiar thing. This light came from directly overhead, white-blue and sourceless, a column of it cutting through the atmosphere with the precision of a surgical blade. It hit the aircraft the way a boot hits a beetle. The engines died, both of them. The propellers windmilled silently, the instruments blinked out, and in the sudden impossible quiet Kai felt the aircraft begin to fall, not like a leaf, but like a stone. He had time to reach for Nadia's hand. That was all the time he had. What came after was not memory. It was sensation in fragments, cold metal beneath his back, lights that smelled wrong, a sound like something eating, and then the face of a thing that was not human looking down at him with what he could only describe, in the language of a mind still assembling itself, as professional satisfaction. And then there was nothing, and nothing was a long, long corridor with no doors, and he walked it for what felt like years. When he came out of the corridor, he was someone else. Not entirely. Enough. They gave him the name Phantom Zero, and they gave him a body that was his own, in the way that a house can be your own after it has been gutted and rebuilt from the studs. The bones were his, the face was his, the muscle and the neural architecture were his, or had been. But threaded through all of it now was something else. Carbon fiber tendons where the organic ones had weakened, subdermal plating at his forearms and sternum, a secondary respiratory system that could filter methane and particulate and airborne toxin with same indifference as a machine filters fuel. His eyes could see into frequencies the human spectrum didn't touch. His fingers could feel the magnetic signatures of electronics through walls. They had built him for war, and he did not know it, because they had also taken his memory, and without memory a weapon does not question what it is. He served them for 11 months. He never asked what he was serving. He was given targets. He eliminated them. He was given patrol routes. He walked them. He was given the names of humans who had been noticed, people who asked too many questions, people who had gotten close to understanding what was operating in the shadows of the world. And he was sent to discourage them, which was a clean word for what it meant. He was good at it. He was very good at it. And he did not feel good or bad about being good at it, because he did not remember enough about himself to feel either thing. The accident was small. It was the kind of small, unremarkable event that changes everything, not because of its magnitude, but because of its timing. He was in a safe house outside of Sao Paulo, waiting for a mission briefing, sitting at a table with a cup of water he had not touched. The safe house was used to be an apartment, and some of the previous tenants' possessions were still there, unremoved, gathering dust in the corners. On the window ledge, catching the afternoon light, was a small paper crane, bright yellow, the kind a child would fold. Kai did not know why he picked it up. He sat there for a very long time holding the small paper crane in his palm. The light moved across the floor. Somewhere outside a radio was playing something with a melody in it. A simple melody, something a mother might hum while cooking. And the combination of the crane and the melody did something to him that no amount of combat or silence or killing had done. It found a crack in what they had built over him, and through that crack something leaked back. Not everything. Enough. He remembered the laugh first. He sat at that table for 4 hours, piecing it back together. The aircraft, the green below, the light from above, the sound of her voice, asking him what would happen if both engines failed. He remembered what he had told her, and he remembered it was a lie, told to keep her from being afraid. He remembered reaching for her hand. And then he remembered that his hand had found hers and then lost it, and that when the dark came, he had been holding nothing, and when he had come back to himself, he had been alone in a way that had no bottom to it. He looked at the paper crane for a long time. Then he put it in his pocket, and he left. They sent 6 of the combat roids after him before sunrise. He killed 4 and disabled 2, and was 40 miles away before the collective's regional node finished processing what had happened. He moved fast and without direction for the first 2 days, because he didn't know where he was going. He only knew what he was moving away from. He slept in drainage culverts and stole food from gas stations and walked through fields in the dark, and each hour that passed brought more of himself back, though it came in the wrong order: skills before memories, and knowledge without context, and the deep muscle familiarity of things he'd done before the corridor that he now had to reconcile with who he thought he was. He thought he was a pilot. He had been a pilot. Now he was something that could kill 6 combat roids before breakfast and didn't flinch at the sight of blood. He was working on squaring those 2 facts with each other when he came across the road. He was in Bolivia by then, 2 weeks out of Sao Paulo, moving south and west along routes that kept him off the major highways. It was early evening, the air still warm from the day. The sky that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before it tips into black. The road was unpaved, and he didn't expect traffic. He was crossing it when the headlights came around the bend, and he stopped, caught in the beams like a deer, and the vehicle, a battered military surplus truck that had clearly seen harder work than it was built for, also stopped. 3 people got out. The first was a woman in her 30s, compact and quick-moving, with the bearing of someone trained to assess threats before she acknowledged them. The second was a man about Kai's age, maybe older, with a prosthetic left arm that was visibly not standard issue, too fine-fingered, too precisely articulated, the kind of work that spoke of either military surplus from a conflict that didn't officially happen, or private manufacture of significant sophistication. The third was a man who walked with a slight drag in his right leg that he had clearly spent years learning to compensate for, and he wore it the way veterans wear things, as something present but not interesting. All 3 of them looked at Kai, not with surprise, with recognition, not personal recognition, the other kind. The kind that says, I know what you are because I've seen one before, or because I am one. You're new, the woman said. It wasn't a question. Kai's hand has moved to his side before he registered moving it. Old reflex. New instinct, the same. Easy, the man with the prosthetic arm said. He raised both hands slowly. The real one and the articulated one palms out. We're not from them. Prove it. I can't, he said. Not here in 30 seconds with the night coming in. But if we were from them, you'd already know it. Kai considered this. It was unfortunately accurate. They had not moved tactically. They had not spread to box him in. They were standing in the road with their hands up, which was either a very sophisticated ambush strategy or it was what it looked like. Where are you going? Kai said. Same place you are, the woman said. We're going to find the others. He didn't get back into any vehicle easily, and he didn't sleep for 3 days after that, but he went with them because the alternative was to keep walking south with no destination and no plan. And he was beginning to understand that he had been used as an instrument of something he despised, and that despising it without acting against it was a version of continuing to serve it. Their names were Sarah Volkov, Damian Cross, and Hideo Tanaka. They called themselves remnants, which was a word Kai found both accurate and bleak. There were others like them, scattered, working in fragments and cells, people who had been taken and remade and had somehow managed to claw their way back to themselves. Some had come back more completely than others. Some had come back but still had the conditioning buried in them, like a splinter that would fester if you pressed on it. All of them had been weaponized. All of them were trying to decide what to do about it. How many? Kai asked, on the 3rd night, round a fire in a shepherd's abandoned stone shelter in the Altiplano. That we know of, Sarah said. 9, including us. He sat with that number for a while. It seemed both too large and too small. Too large, because he could barely comprehend that there were 8 other people in the world who had experienced what he had experienced. Too small, because what they were up against was not something that 9 people would solve with grit and determination. And what are we actually trying to do, he asked. Damien and Hideo looked at each other. Sarah looked at the fire. They're building something, she said. We don't have a complete picture yet, but what we have is bad enough. They call it the fracture system. It's a weapon, not a weapon like a gun or a bomb, more like a key, something that opens a door in the structure of physical space. Our best analysis says it would allow them to pull infrastructure through from wherever they come from. Military infrastructure, the kind of thing that makes the combat roids look like garden tools. And they're close to finishing it. They're close to finishing it. Kai looked at his hands in the firelight. His real hands as much as they were real. The subdermal plating was warm from the fire. He had held a paper crane in these hands, and it had broken open 11 months of conditioning like a fist through glass. He thought about that, and about what it cost to be remade, and about the laugh he would never hear again. "When do we move?" he said. The answer, it turned out, was not yet, and the weeks that followed were the particular kind of hard that is not dramatic, not the hard of combat or crisis, but the slow, grinding hard of preparation, of learning, of bringing 9 people who had each been broken in slightly different ways into something that functioned like a unit. They moved carefully, they gathered intelligence, they found the others, first one, then 2 more, adding fragments to the picture until it was close enough to whole that you could see the shape of it. The collective, which was the name Sarah used for the entity operating through the Baden network, an old human word for an old human fear, pressed into surface against something that had neither a name humanity knew nor a language humanity had mapped. The collective had been present on Earth for longer than most of the remnants wanted to admit. Not in large numbers, not openly. They worked through proxies in darkness, and the slow, patient corruption of infrastructure, inserting themselves into the gaps between human institutions where the oversight was thin. They had been doing it for decades. The combat roids were their field agents. Humans remade, like Kai, like all of them, but remade further, more completely, stripped of more. The fracture system was the next step. It was, as Sarah had described, a key, but understanding what it unlocked required understanding what the collective actually was, and that understanding came to Kai in pieces, assembled from the intelligence they gathered over weeks, and each piece was worse than the last. The collective was not a military force. Not exactly. It was something older than that word implied, something that had developed what humans would recognize as conquest not as a strategy, but as a biological imperative, the way a mold colony spreads, the way a certain kind of fungus fruits, automatic and driven by forces beneath the reach of individual intention. Their homeworld, if homeworld was even the right word for something that had been consuming planets since before humanity had fire, was not a place they missed. It was a machine. They did not have a home they were trying to return to. They had an appetite they were trying to satisfy, and the appetite was for exactly this: worlds that had developed sufficient technological complexity to be interesting, and sufficient organic life to be useful, and insufficient collective resistance to be difficult. Earth, by their calculations, qualified on all 3 counts. The fracture system would let them bring the rest of the machine through. 9 people against the machine. Kai spent a night thinking about that alone, sitting outside the farmhouse they were using as a base in the high desert of northern Argentina, listening to the wind move through the dry grass. The sky was enormous here. The stars were very bright. He thought about his sister, which he did most nights, because the guilt of what he had done while the conditioning held was a thing he needed to carry consciously rather than let it run underground. He thought about the paper crane, still in his pocket, worn soft at the edges. He thought about what he had been before the light came from above, a young man who flew small aircraft and lied to his sister about physics to keep her from being afraid. And he thought about the distance between that person and the person sitting in this field, warm-armed with subdermal ceramic and capable of killing trained soldiers in the dark with his hands. He did not know if the distance was bridgeable. He did not know if the person he had been still existed somewhere in the architecture of the person he had become. What he knew was that the thing which had killed his sister and taken his life and tried to use him as a weapon against his own species was close to opening a door that would let more of itself in, and that the only people positioned to stop it were 9 broken humans sitting in a farmhouse in Argentina, and that if he sat here long enough looking at the stars, he would eventually have to go back inside and help them figure out how. He went back inside. The plan took shape slowly. Its architecture was not elegant. It was the kind of plan that gets built by people who have incomplete information and limited resources and no good options, which meant it had a lot of moving parts and depended heavily on things going approximately right in approximately the right order, which was a luxury no one could guarantee. Sarah was the strategist, not formally trained, but with a gift for systems thinking and an anger that translated cleanly into tactical clarity. Damien was the technical specialist, the one who understood the collective's technology best, partly because he had been modified for technical interfaces and still carried the hardware for it. Hideo was their medic, their logistics anchor, the person who made sure they had food and fuel, and maintained the kind of operational groundedness that kept people functional on very little sleep. The others, Farida, Marcus, Lena, Tomas, Jin, Reyes's, brought their own specific competencies, their own specific damage, their own specific reasons for fighting. Farida had been taken from a research station in Kazakhstan and could still feel, she said, where they had put something in the base of her skull, a ghost of pressure that occasionally made her right eye twitch. Marcus had been taken from a fishing trawler in the Norwegian Sea and had spent 8 months as a combat roid before he came back, and he never talked about the 8 months, and no one asked him to. Lena and Tomas had been taken together from a mountain village in Slovakia, and they had the particular quality of people who have survived something unsurvivable, not intact, but together, which was a different thing. Jin was the youngest of them, maybe 22, and had the most of the conditioning still present in him, which he managed by running every morning for an hour, the way some people manage pain through ritual. Reyes was the one Kai was most unsure about. Reyes had been a soldier before, a real one, human military, trained and deployed in the kind of operations that don't appear in news reports. He had been taken somewhere in Central Africa and had been remade extensively, more than most of them, and what he had returned to was not quite the person he had been before. He was quiet in a way that was different from Jin's quiet, less like someone holding something down, and more like someone who had already set it down somewhere out of sight and could not find their way back to it. He was good in the field, very good, in a way that Kai recognized from his own performance and found uncomfortable. But he had a habit of looking at the group before combat briefings the way Kai imagined a man looks at strangers he has agreed to trust with his life, carefully and not entirely. On the night before the first operation, Kai found him sitting alone in the truck, in the dark, not doing anything. Just sitting. Kai got in the passenger side. He didn't say anything either for a while. Outside, Sarah and Damien were running the final check on the equipment. The sound of them working came through the window. Low voices, the clink of tools, the occasional grunt of effort. First time working with people? Kai said eventually. Reyes looked at him sidelong. I worked with people before. Different now? A pause. Everything is different now. Kai thought about that. He turned the paper crane over in his fingers. A habit he had developed. The way other people develop habits with coins or rings. Something small to anchor the hands when the mind is moving. What's that? Reyes said. Something I found. Kai looked at it. It reminded me of something. What? That I'm a person, Kai said, as opposed to a thing. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I used to play guitar. It was such a human thing to say, in such a human voice, that Kai felt something shift slightly in the equilibrium of the cab. Not toward warmth, exactly, but toward honesty. Toward the acknowledgement that they were both, underneath whatever had been done to them, recognizably something. Any good? Kai said. Reyes almost smiled. Mediocre. We'll get through this, Kai said. He meant it not as a comforting lie, but as a statement of intent, the kind of declaration that is not a prediction, but a commitment. The kind of thing you say when the truth is uncertain, and the alternative to saying it is silence, and silence is worse. Reyes looked at him for a moment, then he nodded once and got out of the truck. The first two operations were designed to be precisely what they were, disruption, not confrontation. They had identified 3 supply chains that fed the fracture system, not the weapon itself, which was being assembled somewhere they had not yet pinned down, but the fuel for it, a synthesized isotope that the collective had been producing at facilities hidden inside legitimate industrial infrastructure. The first facility was in a chemical plant in Paraguay. The second was in a processing center operating inside a shipping logistics company in coastal Brazil. The third was in a mountain installation in Peru, which was both the largest and the most heavily defended. They hit Paraguay first. It went well. Well, in the context of what they were doing, meant that they achieved the objective, disabled the production run without triggering the facility's deeper alert systems, and got all 9 people back to the extraction point. Damien took a hit to the shoulder that was more dramatic than dangerous. And Marcus, who had been covering the north approach, came back with a controlled quality to his movements that told Kai he had done something out there that was testing him. But he came back, and he came back himself, and that was what mattered. Brazil was harder. The facility was more embedded, the defenses more organic, meaning the combat droids they encountered were more independent, less predictable, showing signs of what Damien described as distributed adaptation. They had apparently been learning from the Paraguay operation, extrapolating protocols for the kind of targeted attack the remnants had executed. Kai had expected this. The collective was not stupid. It was simply not accustomed to resistance from this direction. You didn't build anti-personnel defenses facing the direction you came from, but they were learning. The Brazil operation cost them 4 days of recovery time and left Tomas with a dislocated shoulder and a fractured eye, socket that Hideo couldn't fully address with field equipment. It also gave them what they needed. confirmation that the third and final supply chain, the Peruvian installation, was now the last functional source of the synthesized isotope. Everything was going there. The fracture system's completion was accelerating. They had, Damien estimated, 3 weeks. They spent one of them finding the fracture system. It was not where they had expected. They had been working from the assumption that the weapon would be in the same installation as the final isotope supply, hidden in the mountain facility in Peru. This was wrong. The supply chain went to Peru, but from Peru the isotope was being transported, not to another facility, but deeper, to a location that was not on any map Damien's systems could access, a location that appeared on the electromagnetic signatures as a structure of significant size but zero official existence, nestled in the high jungle on the eastern slope of the Andes, where the terrain was so broken and the canopy so thick that aerial reconnaissance had never caught it. Kai knew that jungle. He had flown over it. The last time he had flown over it, his engines had died, and his sister had reached for his hand. He sat with that knowledge for a while when Damien showed him on the map. The others were around the table. Sarah was already plotting approach vectors. No one said anything about the coincidence, because it wasn't a coincidence, and everyone in the room understood what it was without naming it. Kai put his finger on the map on the location. Here, he said, this is where we finish it. The final operation was called, between themselves, the Long Road, which was Lena's name for it, and it suited because it was not a raid, it was a siege. Or the closest thing 9 people could manage to a siege against a fortified installation. With the combat capacity of a small army, they went in 3 teams. Team 1, Kai, Reyes, and Jin, would take the primary approach from the east, where the terrain was hardest and the defenses assumed no attack would come from that direction. Team 2, Sarah, Marcus, and Farida, would approach from the north through the canopy, targeting the installation's power infrastructure. Team 3, Damien, Lena, and Tomas had the most technical mission. They would get to the fracture system itself, and Damien would do what Damien did, which was understand machines and unmake them. They left before dawn. The jungle at that altitude on the eastern Andean slope has a particular quality in the dark, thick and warm, breathing with its own slow pneumatic rhythm, the sound of it constant in white noise and alive in a way that cities are not alive. Kai moved through it with the certainty of someone who had been built for terrain like this, his modified senses reading the dark in ways his original biology never could. The thermal signatures of animals in the canopy, the subsonic vibration of distant machinery, the particular electromagnetic hum of powered structures. He could feel the installation before he could see it, like a headache, but informational. Jin was 2 steps behind him, and to the left, moving well, his breathing controlled, his body doing exactly what it had been trained to do. Reyes was on the right, silent, and Kai could see, in his peripheral thermal reading, that Reyes was running hot in the way people run hot when they are suppressing the kind of thing that needs to be suppressed. You all right? Kai said, barely above a breath. Reyes didn't answer immediately. Then, I know this place. Kai processed this. From before? From before, Reyes said. Different lifetime. They kept moving. There was nothing else to do with that information in this moment except carry it. And they did. At the 2-kilometer mark, they hit the first picket. 3 combat roids, positioned on a natural bridge that gave them good sight lines down the approach. They were standing still in the way that things with distributed combat processing stand still. Not the immobility of boredom or inattention, but the active stillness of a system waiting for input, running pattern recognition on the dark. Kai stopped, assessed, made the call in under a second. The engagement was short and quiet, in the way that things are short and quiet when conducted by people who have been built for it and have made their peace with what that building cost. The 3 combat roids were down before they had time to process the threat as threat rather than ghost, and Kai's team moved through the gap they'd left without stopping. He did not enjoy it. He did not feel good or bad about it. He noted it the way you note weather present, acknowledged, moved through. 3 kilometers became 2, 2 became 1. Then the compound came through the canopy in sections, first as electromagnetic presence, then as structural silhouette, then as visible structure resolving from dark into darker dark, massive and low profile, designed to look from the air like a section of ridge, the walls crusted with transplanted vegetation to defeat aerial recognition. It was much larger than the aerial estimates had suggested. Not a facility. A city in miniature. The thing the collective had been building here quietly for longer than anyone had accounted for. Kai heard Sarah's voice in his earpiece. Team 2 at the power nodes. Ready on your signal. He checked his chrono. Team 3 had another 8 minutes to their position. Hold, he said. 8 minutes. The 8 minutes passed the way time passes when you are lying in jungle dirt staring at a defended installation and trying not to think too far ahead. At the 7 minute mark, Jin made a small sound. Not pain, not alarm, something quieter than either. Kai looked at him, and Jin was staring at the compound with an expression that the night vision rendered green and strange, but that Kai could still read because he knew that expression from the inside. He had seen it in his own face in mirrors. It was the expression of recognition, the specific, visceral recognition of a place that had done something to you. You were here, Kai said. Jin nodded, once, minimally. Stay with me, Kai said. Jin nodded again, and the expression didn't leave his face, but it moved behind his eyes, where it could be managed. Kai understood this. You didn't make it go away. You just moved it somewhere it wouldn't affect your hands. At 8 minutes, Damien's voice came through. Team 3 in position. Team 2? Kai said. Ready, Sarah said. On my mark, Kai said. He looked at the compound. He thought about his sister. He thought about the paper crane in his pocket. He thought about the distance between the person who had lied to keep her from being afraid and the person lying in this dirt. And for the first time, he understood that the distance was not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be acknowledged, that both people were real, and that the second person was doing this for the first person, and that was not a small thing, and it was not nothing. Mark, he said. The compound's external lights went out. In the sudden darkness, something in the installation paused, a collective hesitation, a fraction of a second in which the distributed systems processed the power interruption and recalibrated. Kai was already moving. Reyes was already moving. Jin was already moving. They hit the perimeter at the point Damien had identified as the blind zone between sensor arrays, 3 bodies moving through the gap like water through a crack, and then they were inside. The inside was worse than the outside, in the way that the inside of a machine is always worse than the outside. All the raw mechanism exposed, no cosmetic surface to make it legible. The corridors were not built to human scale. They were close but wrong in the proportions, the ceiling heights off, the width variations following a logic that was not architectural but biological, as though the structure had grown rather than been built. The lighting was emergency backup, a dim red that would have been eerie to anyone who had not already spent time inside collective installations. But Kai had spent time inside one from the other direction, and the red light was familiar in the wrong way. They moved fast, and they moved quietly, and they moved through 3 defensive checkpoints before the compound's internal alert system finished, processing the power disruption, and realized the power disruption was not the problem. By then, Team 2 was already at the backup power nodes, and Team 3 was in the lower levels, and the installation's defenders were trying to respond to 3 simultaneous threats in the dark, which was a logistics problem that Kai had specifically designed to be unsolvable in the time frame available. Not perfectly. Nothing is perfect. They were in the central corridor, 50 meters from the junction that Damien's mapping put between them and the core installation, when Kai turned the corner and found Makaj. He didn't know the name at first. He knew the face. The face was wrong, too altered, too post-human in the particular way the collective's more extreme modifications produced, the jawline restructured, the eyes carrying the signature optical implants that gave them their amber refraction. But beneath the alterations, there was something that triggered recognition in the deep way that faces trigger recognition, below the level of deliberate memory, in the architecture of the self that predates conscious recollection. He had known this person, not from the operations, before the operations, before the corridor. The face reached back into the place inside him that the paper crane had first cracked open and pulled something loose that he had not known was there. Makaj, a name, not a collective designation, a real name, a human name, and with the name came fragments. A barroom somewhere, the sound of football on a television, a man who laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, who had a way of gesturing with both hands when he was explaining something, who had been present at some important juncture of Kai's life before the life that Kai knew how to remember. A friend, an old friend, from the time before the time, and the sight of him now in this corridor, wearing the modifications like a coat over a body that had once been something easy and unguarded, was the worst thing Kai had seen yet in a sequence of things that had repeatedly tried to claim that title. Makaji looked at Kai for a long moment with the amber refracted eyes. Then he said, "What?" in a voice that had been partially reconstructed around a different resonant structure. "I know you. I know you too," Kai said. "They told me you'd run. I did. They said you'd compromised." "Yes." Mikaji tilted his head in a way that was both familiar and wrong, the gesture of the person he had been emerging, through the interface of the person he had become. "Are you going to try and talk me back?" Kai looked at him. He thought about the right answer. He thought about what he wanted the right answer to be. He thought about the distance between those two things, and how that distance was, in some ways, the measure of everything that had happened to both of them. No, Kai said. I'm not. Then what are you going to do? I'm going to ask you something first, Kai said, before anything else. Makaj waited. Are you still in there? Kai said. The real you. The person I knew. You're still in there? The amber eyes didn't change. The modified jaw didn't move. For a moment, the only sound was the emergency lighting's background hum and the distant noise of the compound reacting to the incursion in its outer levels. Then something happened in Makaj's face that Kai had not expected. Not softening exactly, but an inward movement. A fracture along a line that was not architectural but human. The kind of crack that only forms in things that are still underneath the surface. Alive sometimes, Makaj said, when it's quiet. Then I'm asking him, Kai said. The person I knew, I'm asking him to listen. Reyes had moved to cover the junction. Jin was against the wall to Kai's left. The three of them held still in the red emergency light, and Mikaje stood in the corridor, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge made of extremely thin material. They told me things, Mikaji said, about what this is for, the system, the weapon. They told me what it opens and what comes through. I know what it opens, Kai said. I know what comes through. They told me it was necessary, inevitable. They tell that to everything they take, Kai said. They told me too. I didn't know they were telling me because they had to. Not because it was true. Another silence. Mikaji's hands, the modified hands, the ones that could produce, according to the intelligence Sarah had gathered, a variety of compact weapons from hidden mounts in the forearms, were at his sides and still. Something in the stillness was choosing. The control system for the fracture system, Mikaji said. It has a self-destruct. They designed it. They always design a self-destruct. So the system can be collapsed if it's about to be captured. I know where the key is. Kai held very still. Where? With me, Mikaj said. They gave it to me because I was the most modified, the most controlled. The one with the least chance of going the way you went. They gave it to me because they trusted me. He reached into his chest cavity, a small panel, concealed in the modifications, that opened to reveal a space about the size of a closed fist, and he took out a device, the size and approximate shape of a deck of playing cards, matte black, with a single indicator light burning green in its center. He held it out. Kai took it. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, with whatever remained of what they had been to each other, crossing the space between them without language, because there was no language adequate to the moment, only the fact of the exchange, and the fact of the choosing, and the fact that underneath everything that had been done to both of them, something had persisted that was specifically and stubbornly human. You should go, Kai said quietly. When this is done, you should go and find somewhere quiet. I don't know if I can be quiet anymore, Mikaj said. I don't know if I can either, Kai said. We cannot be quiet together somewhere that isn't this. Something in Mikaj's reconstructed face attempted a smile. It didn't quite make it, anatomically, but the intention was clear and that was enough. Then the compound's internal defense protocol, which had finally fully processed the multi-vector intrusion and reached a conclusion about appropriate response level, activated the secondary combat roid cohort, and the corridor stopped being a place for conversation. Kai moved right. Reyes moved left. Jin went through the junction at a run and Kai was 2 steps behind him, the self-destruct key in his left hand, and his right hand doing what his right hand had been built to do, which was clear the path. The combat roids were deployed in the corridor behind them now, and Mikaje was with them, and from the sound of what was happening behind him, Kai understood that Mikaje had chosen fully, finally, in a way that did not require ambiguity, and was paying the price for it, and the price was high, and there was nothing Kai could do about that, except honor it, by finishing what they had all come here to do. Team 3's voice came through the earpiece. We have the fracture system in sight. It's active. They started the activation sequence when the attack began. It's going to complete in approximately 6 minutes. Kai ran. The lower levels of the installation were everything the upper levels were not. Enormous, echoing, built to the scale of the machine rather than its operators. The fracture system occupied a chamber the size of a sports arena, and it was the most alien thing Kai had ever seen in a life that now contained a substantial catalog of alien things. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like a wound. It looked like something that the fabric of the space it occupied was trying to reject. A structure that hurt to perceive directly, not because it was dangerous to look at, but because it was wrong in a fundamental way, assembled according to principles that the human mind had no vocabulary for, and was trying to translate on the fly into something comprehensible and failing. It was beautiful and terrible, and it made the back of Kai's skull ache with a specific kind of pressure that he recognized. After a moment, as the electromagnetic signature of something operating far above the frequencies his modifications had been calibrated to handle. Damien was at the control interface, which was built for collective operators and required modification to interact with, a problem Damien had apparently solved in his characteristically direct way, which was to remove the outer casing entirely and work directly with the internal architecture. Lena and Tomas were covering the chamber's entrances. Sarah and Farida and Marcus were coming down from the upper levels. Kai could hear them in his earpiece, the sounds of combat, of 3 people fighting their way through a corridor toward this room, fast and not clean but functional. The key, Damien said without looking up, his hands inside the machine. Kai crossed the chamber in 12 strides and put the device in Damien's extended hand. There's a problem, Damien said, calmly, in the way that Damien delivered bad news, which was by acknowledging it as quickly as possible so that the time spent processing it could be redirected into solving it. Tell me, the self-destruct will collapse the fracture system, but the collapse generates a pulse, a significant one. Electromagnetic and dimensional. Everything in this chamber gets hit. The systems in this room are shielded enough to survive it. Organic systems in this room, he paused, are not necessarily shielded enough to survive it. Kai processed this. Necessarily? It depends on how much of the organic system has been replaced with shielded components. Damien glanced at him, briefly. The more modified, the more likely to survive the pulse intact. A fully organic human in this room when the key is turned. 50%, maybe less. Someone like me, someone like you, someone like Reyes. He paused again. Better odds, not good odds, better. The sounds of combat from the corridor were getting closer. The fracture system's activation sequence was at 3 minutes. Can you do it remotely? Kai said. Trigger the collapse from outside the chamber? If I had another hour and a different set of tools, yes, Damien said. In the next 2 minutes, no. Then someone stays, Kai said. Someone with the best odds, Damien said. He looked at Kai. You know what the best odds look like. Kai did. He was the most modified of all of them, with the exception of Makaj, who was no longer part of the equation. He had been given the most extensive reconstruction, the deepest integration. The collective had built him as their finest instrument. And what they had built would, in an irony that was too complete to be accidental, give him the best chance of surviving the thing they were trying to destroy. Get them out, Kai said. All of them. Give me the key. Kai! Lena began. Get them out, he said again, and the tone of it was the tone of someone who has already completed the relevant calculations and is now asking for the outcome to be respected. He looked at Damien. Show me how to turn it. Damien showed him. 30 seconds. 1 motion. The indicator light would shift from green to red. Hold it for 3 seconds, then release. That was all. Sarah was at the chamber entrance. We need to move now. Go, Kai said. He looked at them. All of them, or the ones present, with the knowledge of the ones who weren't. He looked at Reyes, who had been a mediocre guitarist and had survived 8 months in someone else's skin, and had come back for this. He looked at Jin, who ran every morning to manage what they had put in him, who was 22 years old, and had more life ahead of him than behind him, which was a thing worth protecting. He looked at Damien, who had hands inside the most complex piece of alien technology on Earth, and wore his prosthetic arm like a fact about the world rather than a wound. He looked at all of them, and then he said simply, go. They went. The chamber doors closed. Kai stood alone in the enormous room with the wounded geometry of the fracture system above him, feeling its electromagnetic scream in his modified bones, and he thought, this is a strange place to end up. He thought, the distance between who I was and who I am has never been clearer than it is right now, standing here, about to do this thing. He thought, Nadia laughed with her head thrown back and her hair coming loose, and she was never afraid of anything. He thought, I told her we would glide down like a leaf. He thought, I wasn't entirely lying. Some of it was true. Sometimes you do fall with grace. He turned the key. The light shifted from green to red. He held it for 3 seconds. He released it. What happened next was not something that had a simple physical description. It was not an explosion in the conventional sense, not a flash of light and a wave of heat, not the kind of force that travels outward from a point. It was more like a correction, like something very fundamental to the structure of the space they were in, deciding, firmly and without negotiation, that it no longer accommodated the fracture system, and acting on that decision with the comprehensive efficiency of natural law. The structure above him did not explode. It unraveled. It came apart at the level beneath molecular, each of its components ceasing to maintain the relationships that had made them a collective whole, falling back into potentiality, and the pulse that this unraveling generated was exactly what Damien had described: electromagnetic, dimensional, and deeply, fundamentally loud in frequencies that did not have names. Kai felt it hit him like a tide. He had time to close his eyes. He had time to put his hand in his pocket where the paper crane was. He had time to think, clearly and without drama. I was a person. That was real. Whatever I became after, I was a person first, and I knew someone who laughed with her whole body, and that was real, and it was enough. The tide took him, and then the tide passed, and he was still there. He was on his hands and knees on the chamber floor, which had cracked along several lines from the structural stresses of the collapse. And there was blood from somewhere. His ear, he thought, from the pressure, and his modified systems were cycling through diagnostic routines in a cascade that was going to occupy his internal processes for several minutes, and he could not quite feel his left arm below the elbow, but the arm was still there and moving when he told it to move, which was promising. He was still there. He sat back on his heels and he breathed. Above him, where the fracture system had been, there was nothing, not a void, not a hole, just absence, the specific emptiness that follows the removal of something from a space it had distorted. The chamber felt lighter. The pressure behind his skull was gone. The electromagnetic scream was gone. The air tasted like air again, which it had not in this room tasted like for a very long time. He sat there breathing for a while. Then the chamber door opened and Reyes came through it, and behind Reyes was Jin, and behind Jin was Sarah, and behind Sarah was everyone else. And Reyes reached down and got an arm under Kai's shoulder and got him to his feet. And for a moment they stood there in the destroyed chamber, looking at the place where the fracture system had been, and then not looking at it, because there was nothing to see, and sometimes nothing is the best possible outcome. "You're still here," Reyes said. It had the quality of surprise. "I noticed," Kai said. Sarah was looking at him with something in her face that he didn't have an immediate word for. Not relief. Exactly. Too complicated for relief, too many things mixed into it. Something that acknowledged the weight of what had just happened and did not try to make it smaller. "Mikaji," she said. Kai shook his head. She nodded. The installation was coming apart around them in the way that things, without their central purpose, come apart. Not with structural drama, but with the slow, incremental failure of everything that had been organized toward an end that no longer existed. The combat roids had gone passive. Not dead. Damien's analysis was that they would eventually reinitialize without the central coordination of the fracture system's associated control network, but that reinitialization would take time. And in that time, they were simply standing where they had been standing, inactive, occupying corridors like furniture. They walked through them. 9 people, or 8 now, depending on how you counted, and Kai counted Mikaje, who had been in there somewhere at the end, and who had chosen, walking through the passive combat roids toward the exits, through the installation that had been built to unmake them and had not managed it. The jungle outside was the same jungle. Dawn was beginning in it, the light coming in through the canopy in long, narrow bands green-gold, the birds starting up in the upper story. The air was warm and wet and alive in the particular way of that particular place on Earth, the eastern Andean slope, where the Amazonian air mass meets the mountain cold and produces a constant productive tension that makes everything grow, fast and enormous and insistently present. Kai stood out the installation entrance for a moment, letting the jungle air into his lungs, feeling the dawn light on his modified face. He reached into his pocket. The paper crane was still there, slightly crumpled from the concussive forces of the last hour, one wing bent at a wrong angle but intact. He held it up in the growing light, turning it, watching the first real dawn of a day that should not have existed cast its light through the folded yellow paper. "What is that?" Sarah said, coming to stand beside him. "A thing that reminded me I was a person," he said. She looked at it for a moment. "I could probably use one of those." "What do you have?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced, with a care that told him she had been carrying it for a long time, a small photograph, not a digital image, a physical photograph printed on paper, worn at the edges. 2 people in a photograph, a woman and a man, laughing, somewhere green and ordinary and entirely unconnected to anything that had happened in the past year. "My family," she said. She put it back. They stood in the dawn for a while, the 9 of them, or 8 or 10, depending on how you counted, because the people who weren't here had still been here, had still been part of this, and the only honest accounting included them, and the jungle went on around them, indifferent and enormous, and the light kept coming. They had a lot of work ahead. This was not the end of the collective's presence on Earth. It was the destruction of their most immediate objective, the loss of their primary operational capability. the kind of setback that would require significant restructuring. There would be combat roids still operating, still coordinating from nodes they hadn't located. There would be human infrastructure the collective had compromised that would take years to fully identify and address. There would be people who had been taken and not yet come back to themselves, still walking through corridors of their own, who had not yet found their paper crane. Kai knew all of this. He thought about it clearly and without the weight of impossibility, because the weight of impossibility was for things that hadn't started yet, and this had started. This was already underway. The distance between what had been and what would be was not a distance anymore. It was a road, and they were on it. He thought about Nadia. He thought about how she would have responded to all of this, the combat, the modifications, the alien installation in the jungle, near where they had fallen. He knew how she would have responded. She would have responded with questions. She would have wanted to understand everything, the biology and the mechanics and the physics of it, asking until she had the whole picture, and then she would have thought about it with her characteristic rigor, and then she would have said something that made everything clearer the way she always had, by being exactly as unafraid as she always was. He could hear her asking him, the way she had asked him in the cockpit with the green below them and the light in her eyes. But what actually happens? Not the lie, the real thing. He thought about what the real answer was. He thought what actually happens is that you fall, and sometimes it's not like a leaf, and it costs something real, and what you're left with is not what you had before. But you are left, and what you're left with is also real, and you do what you do with it, and eventually you are standing in a jungle in the dawn, with people who have each been through their own version of the corridor, people who have each found their own paper crane or photograph or mediocre guitar or morning run, and you have done the thing you set out to do. And what comes next comes next. Reyes touched his shoulder briefly in passing, not a grand gesture, just the physical notation of acknowledgement, the human touch that the collective had never been able to compute, never been able to replicate in its combat roids, never understood the function of, because it didn't have a tactical value, and they had never learned to think in terms other than tactical value, a hand on a shoulder in the morning light. Kai turned and walked back to where the others were gathering. Hideo had found water from somewhere. He was always finding things. Hideo, the foundational ordinary competence that was the less celebrated but perhaps more essential version of survival. He was distributing it with the efficiency of someone who knew that what happened next was going to require everyone functional, and that functional required water, and that water was something he could control when so much else was not. Marcus sat on a fallen log at the tree line, looking at nothing in particular, and the quality of his looking had changed. There was something resolved in it, or resolving, the way things resolve, not through completion, but through the decision to continue. He looked up when Kai came near and Kai nodded back, and that was all, and it was enough. Jin was still running the morning ritual, even now, 20 minutes, dawn, feet on earth, the physical assertion of the self against the drift of what had been done to him. He ran a small circuit at the jungle's edge, watched by the others with the comfortable familiarity of a known quantity, and his running was even and unhurried, and he would stop when he was ready, and they would be there when he did. Damien was already on the technical assessment, cataloging what data could be extracted from the installation before it completed its process of self-deterioration. He worked with the absorption of someone for whom the work was its own answer, the thing that kept the rest of it at a manageable distance. His prosthetic arm worked the salvage components with a precision that his original arm never could have matched, and he did not seem to find this ironic, which Kai respected. Lena and Tomas sat close together, not speaking, in the way of people who have been through enough together that speech is not always the required form. Tomas had his head back and was watching the canopy lighten above them. Lena had her hand in his, loosely, the way you hold something when you're holding it, because it's real and present, and that is sufficient reason. Farida was writing something in a small notebook she kept with her. Kai had seen her writing in it at other camps, other dawn deployments, other mornings after nights that had been one thing or another. He had never asked what she wrote, and she had never offered to say, and the privacy of it was part of its function, and he understood that too. Kai stood and looked at all of them, all 8 of them, alive in the morning on the eastern slope of the Andes in the jungle, where he had once fallen from the sky. He thought, these are the people who were made into weapons. These are the people who refused to stay weapons. These are the people who chose, each of them in their own way and at their own cost, to be something other than what was made of them, and the choice was not easy, and it was not complete. There were still mornings when the conditioning surfaced, still nights when the corridor was close, but it was theirs, and it was ongoing, and it was the most human thing about them, which was to say that it was very human indeed. He put the paper crane back in his pocket. He walked over to where Hideo was distributing water, and he held out his hand, and Hideo put a canteen in it without looking up, efficient and unhurried, the ordinary miracle of someone doing exactly what needs to be done. Kai drank. The water was cold and tasted like the mountain it had come down from, mineral and clear. He stood in the growing light and drank his water, and somewhere above him in the canopy, a bird started up with a sound that was unreasonably beautiful for the time and place and circumstances, and he listened to it. Reyes came to stand beside him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about the guitar thing." Kai looked at him. "If we're doing what comes next," Reyes said, "and we're going to be in the same places for a while." "We are," Kai said. "I might need to find a guitar," Reyes said. "That can be arranged," Kai said. They stood in the morning light with their canteens, in the jungle at the edge of the installation that had tried to crack the world open, and had not managed it, and the bird in the canopy sang its unreasonably beautiful song into the new day, and they listened to it. It was not over. It was a long, long road ahead, and they all knew it, and none of them pretended otherwise, and that honesty was itself a kind of armor, not the ceramic composite kind that ran under Kai's skin, but the older kind, the kind that doesn't protect you from impact, so much as it ensures that when the impact comes, you are facing it rather than running from it. Kai thought about the long road and what was on it, and he felt the weight of it, and he did not set the weight down, because it was not the kind of weight you set down, it was the kind of weight you carry, and carrying it was the work, and the work was ongoing, and ongoing was enough. He thought about Nadia. He thought, "I'm going to find somewhere to put a paper crane." He thought, "When I do, I'm going to fold her name into it." He thought, she would have liked these people. She would have asked them every question she could think of, and then gone quiet and thought for a while, and then said something that made them see themselves differently. She was like that. He stood in the dawn with the canteen in his hand, and the birds above him, and the 8 people he had come to trust past the point where trust requires justification, and the installation behind him diminishing towards silence, and the world ahead of him enormous and undetermined and present. He was a person. He was specifically and stubbornly a person who had been turned into something else and had turned himself back, and the returning had cost something, and the cost was real and known and carried, and he was still here, and the day was beginning, and the fracture system was dust, and what came next came next. He finished the water. He handed the canteen back to Hideo, who was already moving to the next thing, and Kai Murasame, who had been made into a weapon and had become something else, turned his face toward the morning and walked forward into the continuing. The road north out of Peru ran through 3 countries before it reached anywhere Kai considered safe enough to stop for longer than a night. And in those 3 weeks of movement, the 9 of them developed the rhythms of people who had decided, implicitly and without negotiation, to remain a group. It was not a decision that had been announced. It had simply accumulated the way things accumulate that are more comfortable in aggregate than in isolation. They drove, they took turns, they ate in gas stations and roadside commodores, and once memorably, in a truck stop in northern Bolivia that served a lamb stew of such uncomplicated excellence that Hideo ate 3 portions, and Farida asked the cook for the recipe and received, in exchange for her sincerity, a piece of paper with a list of ingredients so long and specific that it would take a proper kitchen and a full afternoon to execute, which felt like an extraordinary promise for later. They talked, sometimes. Not always about the important things. Often about the unimportant things, which was itself important, the reclamation of the ordinary, the deliberate practice of normalcy as resistance against the kind of damage that tries to make normalcy impossible. Marcus had opinions about football that he was willing to share at volume. Lena had read an improbable number of novels and could summarize them in 1 sentence each, which she had demonstrated at length across 200 kilometers of highway on a night when nobody wanted to sleep. Tomas had taught himself carpentry before everything happened, and talked about joinery with the particular reverence of someone who has found in a craft of philosophy. The idea that things fit together precisely, that precision is care, that what holds is what was made to hold. Jin had stopped running every morning. Not stopped, adjusted. He ran 3 times a week now instead of every day, and on the days he didn't run, he did something else, something that was less obviously a management system and more obviously a preference, which was to sit somewhere with a decent view and watch the light change. He was young enough that this change in him registered as growth rather than only as scar tissue, and Kai, watching it, felt something adjacent to hope, which was a feeling he was slowly letting himself get familiar with. Reyes found a guitar in a pawn shop in Cusco. It was not a good guitar, a parlor-sized acoustic of uncertain heritage, one tuning peg replaced with a mismatched substitute, the finish worn through at the body edge where decades of playing had rubbed it back to raw wood. He bought it for the equivalent of $12 and spent an evening tuning it with the focused patience of someone retrieving something long absent. His first attempts were exactly as mediocre as advertised, the chords coming out with the slightly off quality of a skill not exercised for. A long time, muscle memory present but requiring excavation, but he kept at it. In the evenings when they stopped, by whatever light was available, he played, not performing, not for the others, not even for himself as an audience. Just playing, recovering the thing, relearning the physical vocabulary of it, and gradually, over days, the mediocrity became something you just call basic, which is its own kind of progress. Kai sat near him one evening, not close, near, the way you can be near someone doing something private without intruding on it. That's a song, Kai said. Part of one, Reyes said. I only remember part of it. Which part? The middle, Reyes said. I always remembered the middle, never the beginning or end. Kai thought about this. Maybe the middle is enough, he said. Reyes played the middle of the song he half remembered by the light of a lamp in a cheap room in Cuzco, and it sounded the way things sound when they are imperfect and real. Not polished, not finished, not ready to be heard by anyone beyond this, but present. Audible. Existing in the air of the world, rather than in the silence of the forgetting. Had been in contact with people he trusted, laying the groundwork for the next phase, which was the work that didn't involve warehouses and combat, but was in many ways harder. The patient, systematic exposure of the collective's embedded infrastructure, the identification and approach of people who had been taken and might still be recoverable, the building of something that had the durability of a long project rather than the intensity of a crisis response. He worked with the particular efficiency of someone who has replaced urgency with steadiness, and finds steadiness preferable, and the picture he was building was complex and would take time, and the time was available. Sarah had been making calls of her own. She was the one among them most capable of moving in the world that had not changed. The human world, the official one, the world of institutions and reporting chains, and the particular language of people who maintained the infrastructure of civilization. She had contacts from before, some of them she trusted. She was testing which ones carefully the way you test ice, 1 foot, gradually increasing weight, watching for the tell of the crack. She told Kai about one of them, on a night when they were sitting outside the vehicle on a stretch of highway in the Altiplano, the sky overhead dense with stars, and both of them too wound down from the day to sleep. She's with the signals intelligence outfit that has been watching certain anomalies for 3 years, Sarah said. Anomalies that map to collective operational signatures. She doesn't know what she's looking at. I'm going to help her understand what she's looking at. That opens a door, Kai said. Several, Sarah said. Some of them dangerous. Most of them, she said. But closed doors don't open the way forward. He thought about this. He thought about what the way forward actually looked like. Not the abstract idea of it, the warm-toned narrative of determined people building a better outcome, but the practical reality of it, which was going to be slow and expensive, and involve a great deal of explaining things to skeptical people in institutions that had been compromised in ways they didn't know, and the work of convincing them without exposing them to what happened to people who got exposed prematurely. He thought about Nadia again. She would have been good at this part. She had been, in the life he was putting back together from its fragments, the kind of person who could walk into a complicated situation and see the human beings in it, and talk to them in ways that made them feel understood, rather than managed. He had been the pilot. She had been the one who knew how to navigate. He reached into his pocket, the paper crane. He thought about what he had said he would do. Find somewhere to put it. Fold her name into it. He hadn't done it yet. He wasn't sure he was ready to do it yet. There was something about carrying it that still felt necessary. The physical weight of it in the pocket, the habit of it. He thought, maybe that was all right. Maybe the putting down of the thing you carry is a thing you know when you know it, and not before. He looked at the stars. Sarah looked at the stars. How many more do you think there are? She said. Like us. People they took. A lot, he said. More than we've found. We're going to find them, she said. Not a question. A commitment, in the way that the best commitments are not dependent on certainty. We're going to find them, he said. They sat in the altiplano with the stars overhead and the dry grass moving in the night wind and the vehicle behind them with everyone in it sleeping, or pretending to sleep, and the world ahead enormous and present and full of work that needed doing, and they sat with that, which was the most honest way to sit with something that mattered. Before dawn, Kai got up and went around to the driver's side and got in, and sat for a while with his hands on the wheel, not to drive, just to feel it. The ordinary texture of an ordinary thing, the wheel warm from the previous driver's hands, the instrument panel dark and quiet, the silence of a vehicle at rest. He thought about a small twin-prop aircraft above an Amazonian canopy at 1,100 feet. He thought about the green below, continuous and alive and indifferent to altitude. He thought, I am going to find that place. Not today, not soon, but eventually. I am going to go back to where we fell, and I am going to put a paper crane in the jungle, where the trees are so thick that the light that reaches the forest floor is green and ancient, and has been filtered through 1,000 canopy layers, and I am going to fold her name into it, and I am going to stand there for however long it takes. And then I am going to get back in a vehicle and drive toward the continuing, because that is what people do. That is, specifically and stubbornly and unreasonably, and without the guarantee of any particular outcome, what people do. The door opened, and Reyes got on the other side. Can't sleep either, he said. No. Reyes reached over the seat and came back with the guitar. He settled it on his knee and began playing the middle of the song he remembered, quiet enough not to wake anyone, just a sound in the dark cab of the vehicle, tentative and imperfect and real. Kai sat with his hands on the wheel and listened. Outside, the altiplano ran to the horizon, dark and enormous, and the stars above it were very bright, and the night was cold, and the morning was coming. It was always coming. That was the thing about mornings. They did not wait to see if you were ready. They simply arrived, and you met them with what you had, and you drove forward into them, which was all any human being had ever been able to do, and it had always been enough to matter. Kai started the engine. The headlights came on. The road appeared. They drove. The title came to Kai somewhere in the Atacama, weeks later. Not Phantom Zero. Not the designation the collective had given him. He had been thinking about the 10 of them, 9 alive, one who had chosen at the last, and about what they actually were. Not the names the collective had assigned. Not the roles they'd been fitted for. What they actually were. He said it out loud, once quietly, to nobody in particular, while the desert went by on both sides and the others slept in the back. He said, "We are riders." Not because of any ceremony or appointment. Because of something more basic. They had all been knocked off course, knocked out of the life they were traveling, and they had gotten back on. They were moving again, under their own direction. That was what a rider was, not a title. A verb, someone who rides. He kept it to himself for a few more days, turning it over, checking it from different angles, the way you check a thing you've found, to determine whether you found something or invented something, which is a different and less durable category. Then he mentioned it to Sarah. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's 10. You're counting Makaj." "I'm counting Makaj," he said. She considered this seriously, the way Sarah considered things. Fully, without dismissal, with the respect that genuine consideration gives to something that is trying to be real. "Riders," she said. "Riders," he said. She was quiet for another moment. The desert went by. The light on the Atacama at that hour was the kind of light that makes the plane of it look like the floor of an ancient sea, which is what it was, once before the water retreated and left the salt and the silence. "I think he knew he wasn't coming out," she said. "Makaj, I think he knew when he gave you the key." "I think so too," Kai said. "That means he chose it." "Yes. That's..." She stopped. "Human," Kai said. "It's human." She looked at the desert for a while, then she said, "Riders." And that was that. They added it to nothing official, because there was nothing official to add it to. It lived in the way they referred to themselves in conversation, in the internal shorthand of people who have a shared understanding that needs a word. The remnants had been a name given by circumstance. Riders was a name they chose, and the difference between a given name and a chosen name is the difference between being assigned a category and claiming one, and the claiming mattered. Damien's contact work was beginning to bear something. Not fruit yet, not the solid actionable results of the kind that you could build on directly, but the early signs of a network taking shape, nodes of awareness, connecting to other nodes, the slow dawn of a coordinated understanding of what the collective was and where it was embedded and what it would take to address it systematically. There were people in intelligence services in 3 countries who were beginning to compare anomalies that had previously been filed in different categories and not cross-referenced. There were people in two academic institutions who had been studying the same electromagnetic signatures from opposite angles and had never met each other. Damien was, with great patience and significant care, engineering the meetings. It would take years. That was the honest assessment. Not decades. The collective's operational timetable had been set back significantly by the destruction of the fracture system, and the advantage that bought was not infinite, but it was real, but years. And the years would require the riders to move in two worlds simultaneously. The operational world of finding and disrupting the remaining collective infrastructure, and the slower world of building the human knowledge base and institutional awareness that would eventually allow the response to outlast any single group of people. We need to think about what happens to what we know, Farida said one evening, with her notebook open on the table in front of her and her pen doing the particular resting thing it did when she was working out a thought. Not just operational knowledge, everything we know about them, their biology, their operating protocols, their technology, what works against them and what doesn't. It needs to exist somewhere that isn't inside 9 people's heads. 10, Kai said from habit. Farida looked at him. 10, you're right, Sarah said. We need to document. I've been doing some of it, Farida said. She gestured at the notebook. But properly, systematically, in a form that other people can use. The work of that documentation took a month and produced something that was not, by any professional standard, a finished or polished document. It was the first draft of something, with gaps and contradictions and the rough texture of knowledge assembled under difficult conditions. But it was also the first account of the collective's presence on Earth, written by humans who had been inside the machine and come back out, which made it something that no amount of external observation could have produced, and Kai understood its value in a way that went beyond the tactical. It was evidence, not just of what the collective was, of what the riders were, of the fact that human beings had been taken and had turned themselves back, and had fought their way to a morning after, and that this had happened, and that it mattered, and that the record of it deserved to exist. Hideo typed the final version on a laptop balanced on a cooler in a rented room in Antofagasta, with the sound of the Pacific outside the window. Far enough that it was only a suggestion, a background texture, the ocean doing what the ocean does, which is to continue regardless of what happens on the land above it. He typed with 2-fingered efficiency, not fast but steady, and when he finished he said nothing, just closed the laptop and went to make tea. Kai read it through once, beginning to end. He thought about the paper crane still in his pocket. He thought, this is the other kind of paper crane. This is the thing that says, we were here. This happened. We were real. He thought about Nadia. He thought, I'll tell you about it. When I find the place in the jungle and I put down the crane, I'll tell you about it. I'll tell you about the 9 of them, the 10 of them, the road south and north and wherever it goes next. I'll tell you about Reyes and the guitar. I'll tell you about Lena and Tomas, who hold hands without thinking about it. I'll tell you about Marcus, who has opinions about football, and about Farida, who asked a stranger for a recipe as though the world were still the kind of place where recipes were the important thing and was not wrong to do so. I'll tell you about Jin, who runs, and Hideo, who finds water when there is none, and Damien, who takes machines apart and understands what they were trying to do. I'll tell you about Sarah, who is angry in the way that the most useful people are angry, not consuming and not self-defeating but productive, converted to clarity. I'll tell you about Makaj, who was your kind of person, the kind who asks questions until they have the whole picture, and then says something that makes other people see themselves differently. I'll tell you that he was in there, right up until the end, and that he chose something true, and that I count him. I'll tell you that we called ourselves writers. I'll tell you that the morning came. He folded the document's final page along the edge of the cooler, a habit, a reflex, the paper folding under his modified hands with the precision of something that had been done before. He stopped before it was anything, just a fold, a single crease across the page. He left it like that. Unfinished. There was something honest about an unfinished thing. He put the paper crane in his other hand, the worn yellow one, with one wing slightly wrong from the pulse in the pulse chamber, and he sat with both things, one finished and one not, and he was very present in that moment, very much a person in a room, with the sound of the ocean outside and the smell of Hideo's tea coming from the corner in the road ahead. He thought, I'm ready to find the jungle, he thought. Not yet, but soon. He thought, soon is enough. He put both things away, and he got up and went to where Hideo was with the tea, and he held out his hand, and Hideo gave him a cup without looking up, and it was warm and simple and exactly what it was, and Kai stood in the rented room in Antofagasta drinking tea, with the sound of the Pacific suggesting itself beyond the window. He was a writer. He was a person. He was, still and always and first and last, a human being who had fallen from the sky and gotten back up. That was the story. That was all of it. The morning came. They drove.